Tim Tyler, just a great guy. He's a former civilian intelligence officer for the U.S. Department of Defense. He's worked at U.S. embassies in Panama, Bolivia, and Afghanistan. 6 tours in Afghanistan, 4 of which were as an advisor with the Afghan National Security Forces, also a U.S. Navy veteran who served in Operation Southern Watch. But he wrote a book, The Decline and Fall of the Shah, which talks about the history of the Iranian Revolution from 78 to 79, the collapse of the Pahlavi regime. It reveals why the Iranian military, which was one of the largest in the world, collapsed in slightly over 1 year. It also discusses the seizure of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, the Iran-Iraq War, and Iranian terrorism from 1980 to the present. Tim Tyler, great to have you back on the show. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Oh, well, thank you, Aaron. It's a great honor to be on your show.
You, what's your reaction to the news this week? You know, for a lot of people, it's almost like they're trying to pretend that somehow this hostility between the U.S. and Iran started with Donald Trump. They don't realize it goes back all the way to 1979 and has been going on since then.
Well, you know, Aaron, you just hit the ball right out of the park on that. Iran has a long history of anti-U.S. terrorism. Let's take a quick look at that. October 23rd, 1983, the U.S. Marine Corps barracks in Beirut were bombed. 243 Americans were killed in this bombing. This was done by a group called the Islamic Jihad Organization, which was actually a front for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which, by the way, our late friend General Soleimani was in charge of. So, 243 Marines, soldiers, and sailors were killed in 1983 by the Islamic Revolution or Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Let's look at some other incidents. April 14th, 1988, the U.S. frigate Samuel B. Roberts is cruising through the Persian Gulf and hits a mine, and the ship almost sunk. This mine was placed out there by the Iranians as well. So they were directly attacking us that day. Let's look at a third very sad day where more American servicemen were killed by the Iranians. June 25th, 1996, Khobar Towers, Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. 19 U.S. Air Force personnel were killed by Hezbollah of the Hejaz. This was a front group, again, for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. So this is not something that Donald Trump suddenly invented. There's a long history of the Iranians killing U.S. servicemen, and I, for one, am very glad that we took out the leader of a terrorist group responsible for killing hundreds of U.S. servicemen.
Yeah, and I'm glad you shared that history from the 80s and the 90s, because at least some of the folks, even who have been falling for this Iranian propaganda in the last few days, at least they've at least acknowledged the fact that this Iranian terrorist leader, Qasem Soleimani, that he was responsible for the deaths of at least 600 American service members in Iraq. But that's why I'm glad you go back and point out the larger history, going all the way back to the 80s and 90s. Now, of course, Soleimani didn't come in until the late 90s, but again, you make the great point that this goes back all the way to 90. This goes back 40 years. This didn't just dust up this week. What else was your reaction this week, and how noteworthy was it to actually see Iran firing ballistic missiles into Iraq?
Well, Iran is basically the bully on the block. They're always trying to intimidate people. After they attacked the Samuel B. Roberts, we actually sunk 2 of their ships. We sunk a patrol boat called the Josan and a frigate called the Sahand. And, it's really funny. We took out 2 of their ships. They're permanently on the floor of the Persian Gulf, and the Iranians just backed down. They realized, hey, you don't want to get into a fight with the biggest guy on the block. And I think that's just what we need to do. Whenever Iran is involved with an attack on U.S. personnel, we need to go after them, and I just don't think they really have the stomach to take the U.S. on in a long series of attacks. If you notice when they fired the rockets, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there was any U.S. casualties. So that sounds like, to me, it was just a token response to us killing the leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Well, and now not only is apparently the the Ayatollah basically saying, he's basically saying that we've given our response here. But even apparently now there's news reports that Muqtada al-Sadr, who heads up Shiite militias in Iraq, is basically also telling his militiamen to stand down, saying the crisis is over. And so, yeah, again, point back to the history that you've documented in this book and the history that you're aware of. And none of this was shared in much of the mainstream national media over the past few days. Instead, it was like they were cheerleading us into World War III and lecturing us about how we should never respond to the terrorist actions of Iran, or it'll lead us into World War III, when we've had instances like this in the past where, as you point out, we actually sunk 2 of their ships and they knew not to start a war with us.
Correct. And a third ship, a frigate called the Sabalan, it took on so much water in that attack, it actually had waves slashing over its main deck. And, let me just throw out one more date for your listeners to realize. A lot of your listeners are probably thinking, well, the Middle East, it's a long way away. The Iranians aren't actually doing something in America. The Iranians have done terrorist attacks in America. On July 22nd, 1980, an Iranian dissident named Ali Akbar Tabatabai was assassinated in Bethesda, Maryland. He had been the press attaché at the Iranian embassy in Washington, D.C. under the Shah, and all he was doing was writing articles against Ayatollah Khomeini that were being published in the Washington Post. And they basically had a guy walk up to his front door dressed as a mailman, had him sign for a registered mail package, and then shot him and killed him. So the Iranians have done terrorist attacks in this country. I'm really amazed that none of the liberals are even remembering these dates.
Yeah, and then on top of that, Lara Logan made a great point last night on Fox News, and I spoke with her yesterday on this show. She's the former 60 Minutes correspondent, war correspondent, and she was just amazed and outraged at the fact that so many in the national media were just ignoring the voices of all of the anti-Soleimani folks in the Middle East, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, and then even inside of Iran. And they've ignored the thousands of protesters who were gunned down, innocent, unarmed protesters. And so just the media bias and the way they've just run with this propaganda is just outrageous. Any take on, I guess, what have you been thinking as somebody who's documented the news of the history of Iranian terrorism? What was your reaction to a lot of the media coverage this past week?
Well, my first thought was, how intelligent or unintelligent are these people? You and I were both in the military. A lot of our actions are governed by the Geneva Convention. Well, the Geneva Convention defines a lawful combatant as an active duty member of a regular military unit, a guy wearing a uniform, and someone who is actively involved in military operations. General Soleimani met all 3 of those definitions. So he was clearly a legitimate military target. I have yet to hear anyone on CNN or the New York Times bring up the Geneva Convention. It seems like we're very quick to sometimes hold soldiers to very high standards on the field of battle and say, oh, he's not operating correctly. But gee whiz, when we kill a bad guy, suddenly nobody wants to look at the Geneva Convention and say, oh, according to international military law, this guy was a legitimate combatant.
Maybe we've only got about a minute or so to go here. I would encourage everybody to check out Tim Tyler's book. You can find it online, The Decline and Fall of the Shah. Tim, with the minute or so we have left, I guess, what do you want to tell folks back here about Iran and about the situation of today, or maybe just about the global network of terror that they operate, including probably elements here in America?
Sure. Well, let me just give you one takeaway. The former U.S. Embassy in Tehran, which was seized by the Iranians in November 1979, today is the headquarters for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. So I think Iran was not only planning this first attack on the embassy in Baghdad, which they did, but was probably planning a second attack where they were going to seize the embassy in Baghdad and basically relive their glory days of seizing the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And, I thank God that Trump sent in over 100 Marines to help secure that embassy. I thank God that he sent in a battalion of paratroopers to Kuwait to be a standby force. I think he really did everything that he could to secure the area.
Well said.
And you contrast that to Jimmy Carter in '79, who basically, let the embassy be seized and did almost nothing.
Yeah, well said. Tim Tyler, author of The Decline and Fall of the Shah. Always great to talk with you, my friend. Thanks for all you do.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for your service in Iraq and Afghanistan, Aaron. God bless you.
All right, God bless you, Tim.